Everything we think we know about the Second World War is dangerously incomplete. We were taught that it began with a single invasion, a single dictator, a single moment in 1939. But history rarely erupts overnight. Beneath the surface of that global catastrophe lay decades of hidden forces, economic collapse, psychological trauma, silent political experiments, and decisions made in rooms the public never saw. The war did not begin with gunfire. It began with ideas, with fear, with humiliation, with a system quietly breaking long before the world noticed. What if World War II was not an accident, but an inevitable outcome? What if millions of lives were shaped by mechanisms already set in motion years before the first shot was fired? To understand the war, we must go deeper, beyond textbooks, beyond timelines, and into the dark machinery that made global destruction not just possible, but unavoidable. The story does not begin in 1939. It begins in silence, on a cold morning in 1919, inside a grand hall in Versailles. The First World War had just ended, but instead of peace, something far more dangerous was being constructed. The Treaty of Versailles was not simply an agreement, it was a punishment. Germany was forced to accept full blame for the war, surrender vast territories, dismantle its military, and pay reparations so massive they would cripple its economy for generations. On paper, it looked like justice. In reality, it planted the seeds of something far darker. Imagine an entire nation humiliated, stripped of pride, drowning in debt, and surrounded by enemies. Inflation spiraled so violently that money became almost meaningless. People carried wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy bread. Families lost everything overnight. But the most dangerous consequence was not economic, it was psychological. A wounded identity. A population searching for someone to blame. And in that vacuum, something began to grow. At the same time, across Europe, the old world was collapsing. Empires that had stood for centuries, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, the Russian, were gone. Borders were redrawn overnight, often ignoring ethnic realities, creating fragile nations filled with tension. Millions were displaced. Governments were weak. Revolutions simmered. It was not peace. It was instability disguised as order. Then came the 1920s, a decade often remembered for glamour and progress. But beneath the surface, cracks were spreading. The global economy was fragile, dependent on loans and unstable markets. And in 1929, everything shattered. The Great Depression did not just destroy wealth, it destroyed trust. Banks collapsed. Businesses vanished. Unemployment surged into the millions. Entire societies fell into desperation. And desperation changes people. When people are hungry, they stop believing in systems. When they feel betrayed, they stop trusting democracy. When they lose hope, they become vulnerable to something far more dangerous: certainty. Strong voices. Simple answers. Leaders who promise to restore pride, rebuild nations, and punish enemies. This is where the mystery deepens. Because World War II was not simply caused by one man rising to power. It was enabled by millions of people who were ready, psychologically, economically, emotionally, to follow. The conditions had been engineered long before he appeared. The anger, the fear, the longing for identity. But here is the unsettling question historians still grapple with. If the war was built on systems, on collective trauma, on global instability, then was it ever truly avoidable? Or was the world already moving towards something inevitable, long before anyone realized what was coming? To understand how the world drifted toward catastrophe, we have to look beyond events and into systems. Because what unfolded between the wars was not chaos, it was a chain reaction. A fragile global structure, slowly destabilizing under pressure, until collapse became unavoidable. At the center of it all was economics. After World War I, the global financial system became deeply interconnected in a way never seen before. The United States loaned vast amounts of money to Germany, allowing it to pay reparations to Britain and France, who in turn used that money to repay debts to the United States. It was a loop, a delicate cycle of borrowed stability. But like any system built on debt, it required constant motion. The moment it stopped, everything would fall. And in 1929 it did. The stock market crash in the United States sent shockwaves across the world. American banks called in their loans. Germany's economy collapsed almost overnight. Factories shut down. Millions lost their jobs. And with that collapse, the fragile illusion of recovery disappeared. What remained was anger, raw, directionless, and growing. But economics alone does not start wars. What transforms crisis into conflict is human psychology. In times of uncertainty, people begin to simplify the world. Complex problems demand simple explanations. Who is responsible? Who is to blame? And this is where a dangerous mechanism begins to operate: the creation of enemies. Not just political enemies, but cultural, ethnic, and ideological ones. The idea that a nation's suffering is not random, but caused by specific groups. This is not unique to one country. It is a recurring pattern in human history. But in Germany, it became something more organized, more calculated. Propaganda was not just used, it was engineered. Messages were repeated, refined, and embedded into daily life. Fear was amplified. Identity was reshaped. A narrative was constructed where the past humiliation of a nation could be reversed through unity, strength, and elimination of perceived threats. And here lies the twist. Many people did not initially support extreme ideology. They supported stability, jobs, order, dignity. The system did not demand immediate loyalty. It gradually redefined what loyalty meant. Step by step, the unthinkable became acceptable. Then normal. Then necessary. Meanwhile, outside Germany, the rest of the world was watching, but not acting. Britain and France, exhausted from the First World War, were desperate to avoid another conflict. Their strategy became one of appeasement, allowing small violations in hopes of preventing a larger war. But this approach had an unintended effect. Each concession signaled weakness. Each delay gave time. Time to rearm. Time to expand. Time to test how far the system could be pushed before it responded. And it did not respond. What we begin to see is not a single failure, but a network of failures: economic collapse, psychological vulnerability, political hesitation, and international inaction, all interacting, reinforcing each other. The world was not sleepwalking into war. It was being pulled, slowly, irresistibly, by forces that no single nation fully controlled. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: by the time the war officially began, the mechanisms driving it had already been in motion for years. By the time the first shots of World War II were fired, the outcome was no longer shaped by a single decision. It was the release of pressure that had been building for decades, like a fault line finally snapping beneath the surface of the world. What followed was not just war, but industrialized destruction on a scale humanity had never seen. Cities turned to ash. Entire populations displaced. Tens of millions of lives erased. But the most disturbing truth is not how the war was fought, it is how easily the conditions for it were created. Because the same mechanisms that led to World War II are not unique to that moment in history. They are patterns, repeatable, observable, and deeply embedded in human societies. Economic collapse. Collective humiliation. Fear of the other. The rise of narratives that promise order in exchange for control. These are not relics of the past. They are forces that can emerge anywhere, at any time. Consider how quickly perception can shift. A neighbor becomes an enemy. A disagreement becomes a threat. A crisis becomes an excuse to abandon principles once thought unbreakable. The line between stability and chaos is thinner than we imagine. And history shows that it does not take decades to cross it, only a series of small, unchecked steps. This is where the scale of the story expands beyond World War II itself. Because what we are really looking at is not just a historical event, but a reflection of human nature under pressure. When systems fail, people do not always choose cooperation. They choose survival, identity, control. And in doing so, they can become part of mechanisms far larger, and far more destructive, than they realize. But there is an even deeper implication. The war did not end these mechanisms. It only paused them. After 1945, the world rebuilt. New systems were created. International organizations, economic safeguards, political alliances, all designed to prevent another global catastrophe. And for decades they worked. But systems are only as strong as the people who maintain them. And over time, the same pressures begin to return. Economic inequality, political polarization, distrust in institutions, the quiet reappearance of narratives that divide rather than unite. It does not look like history repeating itself. It looks like history preparing itself. And this is the final, unsettling realization: World War II was not an anomaly. It was a warning. A demonstration of what happens when multiple fragile systems fail at once, and when humanity responds not with understanding, but with fear. We often measure history in years, in battles, in leaders. But the forces that shape it are far deeper. Invisible currents of emotion, belief, and structure, moving beneath the surface, long before events make them visible. And perhaps the most haunting question is not why World War II happened, but whether we would recognize the signs, if it were beginning again. Because civilizations do not fall in a single moment. They unravel, slowly, quietly, until one day, the world wakes up, and realizes it is already too late.